So after the women get into the workforce and start producing in place of the men who had gone off to war, it's time to really look at the war economy and how that's shaping up. So wages go way up in this time. It's a whole supply and demand thing. The supply was down because men were off at war, and demand was up because we needed stuff for the war. So wages double in this time period. Here's the problem though. Wages double, so do prices. So it's a win-lose situation here for people. Now, the Wilson administration starts a group called the Food Administration, and the guy who's in charge of that is Herbert Hoover, future president. And the Food Administration's job is to figure out how to get the American economy geared towards producing food for the guys at the front. So he really calls on people to start conserving what they eat and thinking very carefully about what choices they make in their diets, because if it's food that we can send overseas, then we need to do that. Food that needs to be consumed here, because it won't last until it gets overseas, preservatives really weren't a big thing then we can consume that here, okay? So he calls on Americans to do meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, and to start conserving in that manner. So conservation was a big thing. Farm your own. The people started Liberty Gardens. They started farming on their own home land. Rather than going out to the supermarket and buying all their stuff, they would farm at home and create gardens where they could produce their own produce to consume at their homes, rather than buying it off the shelves and keeping it from getting to the boys. Now, we're going to take plowboys, farmers, and we're going to make them into doughboys. Doughboys were our GIs. In order to do that, we needed to raise an army. We really had no desire. Americans really thought we could stay out of the war. We would just help support the Allies. Well, that doesn't work so well. We had no real intention of sending men to Europe initially. But when the French and British troops really begin to diminish in number, because so many of them are getting killed and they're losing a ton of money, it becomes very apparent to Wilson and the leaders of this country that we have to send American troops over there to support this war effort, or we're going to lose. So we institute a draft in order to build up our numbers, because initially we only had 200,000 troops in our standing army at that time. So we need to build up our numbers, because 200,000 isn't going to cut it. So they institute a draft. There were no buyouts in this draft. Unlike the Civil War, where you could pay, if you were wealthy, a poorer person to serve for you, you couldn't do that in World War I. If your number was pulled, you served. End of story. No buyouts. So over a period of just a few months, we take the army from 200,000 troops to over 4 million. Now, what does that mean? That means that they were not very well trained, because you can't, in a matter of a few months, train that many soldiers and expect them to be trained in the manner that they needed to be. So a lot of their training was done on the spot in Europe. 11,000 women would go to war, and not on the front lines. I mean, we only just got permission to go to the front lines in the last few months in 2013. But 11,000 women would support the war effort in the military by being nurses, attendants, secretaries, communicators, where they would run the phone lines and so forth, or send telegrams. That's the kind of work that women did, okay, for the war effort. It's no coincidence that after the war, because of women's service in the war and their service at home working in industry, that women's suffrage comes to be right after the war ends. It only takes about a year. And that happens in France as well as here. Now, in Europe, this is what's going on. So the Russian Revolution has happened. Germany's now fighting a one-front war. They can concentrate all their efforts on fighting off Germany or Great Britain and France. Germany hopes that they can, within 6 months of declaring unlimited submarine warfare or unrestricted submarine warfare, they're hoping they can cripple Great Britain by surrounding basically Great Britain with their U-boats and keeping any merchants or war supplies from coming into the country. So they're hoping in 6 months they can cripple Great Britain. That doesn't happen. The French, the Allied commander at this time, before the Americans got there and shortly after the Americans got there, the Allied commander is French Field Marshal Foch, and he's trying to keep it together. He's trying to keep the Allied forces from crumbling. In May of 1918, the Germans are going to be within 40 miles of Paris. Danger, danger. This is not good. 40 miles from Paris, they're just a short march away. They could take France at any time. Remember, the object of the game of war is capture the capital. They're 40 miles away. This is not good for France. By June and July of 1918, the Americans begin to arrive. This is Germany's worst nightmare. They wanted to get all of this done, cripple Great Britain, capture Paris. They wanted to get all that done before the Americans could get there, because then the war would be over. Well, that doesn't happen, because in the summer of 1918, the Americans show up. And we show up. Remember, we couldn't fly our troops over because we weren't using planes for transport at that time. So we couldn't fly our guys over to Europe, and we really hadn't flown across the Atlantic at this point in anything. So we had to ship them over. So this takes several weeks to put all of that together, the logistics of shipping millions of men across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. That's a logistical nightmare for somebody to work out. And we finally get it done in June and July. Now, where do we see action? We see action in only a couple of battles in World War I. We're really not in it that long. We get there in June and July. By November, it's over. So we're only in this thing for about 5 months. The Second Battle of the Marne is from July 15th to August 6th. And we see some action here, but it's limited because we've only just arrived. We're still sort of getting our acts together. This is the last offensive by Germany. They launched this offensive. They come at the French, and this is going to be the last one. Okay? They don't see any more offensive action in the entire war. The Germans were overwhelmed by 350 or 347 or so Allied tanks. That's what really wins the Battle of the Marne, are the tanks that happen here. This is fought in the Verdun region, and if you look at any of the paintings that were done after the Battle of Verdun, you can see the destruction that took place in this war. Pretty awesome. You should probably do a Google image search for Battle of Verdun images and look at the paintings that were done afterwards, the photography that was done afterwards. It was devastating. The French would not be able to farm this region for decades. It would take to get this rebuilt into proper farmland. Now, this is the beginning of the end of World War I. So we're getting there. Now, the biggest battle that the Americans saw was MEUSE-Argonne. Now, MEUSE-Argonne offensive is what it was called, but it was also known by two other names. One was the Battle of the Argonne Forest. There was a movie made a few years ago about this because we actually fired on our own troops in that one. Icky. We win the battle ultimately, but there was some friendly fire where American troops got trapped in the no man's land, essentially, between the two sides, and those American troops got fired on by the Allies. It was really quite ugly, but the movie's excellent. I wish I could remember what it was called. And it might just be called Argonne Forest. The other name for this is the Grand Offensive, because this is the last big push of the war. You will notice that both with the Battle of the Marne that lasts about 3 weeks, and this one, which goes from September 26th to the armistice, which is November 11th, so about a month and a half, you'll notice that these battles are much longer. They're one battle, but they're much longer than anything we've ever seen in history before. The Civil War, Gettysburg was 3 days. We thought that was tremendously long. Nah, now it's a month and a half. So this is the last Allied offensive. The objective of this battle was to cut German rail lines. If we can cut their rail lines, we can cut their supplies, including food and munitions. So this was really important. This is the biggest operation in victory for the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. The man in charge of the AEF was John Pershing. Okay? The Americans felt really left out of the Battle of the Marne and Saint-Mihiel, which is another small battle they fight. But so we didn't want to play second fiddle to the British or the French, so we asked for our own front. We wanted our own commander, General John J. Pershing. Remember the guy who chased Pancho Villa around the desert Southwest? He's given his own front. Blackjack Pershing is in charge now of the AEF. This is the bloodiest single battle in U.S. history. Still. We would lose almost 100,000, over 100,000 men in this battle. It's pretty brutal, pretty bad. But that was nothing compared to what the French and the French and the British had lost throughout the years of World War I. They had lost millions of men. Our sacrifice is relatively small compared to theirs, and they would let us know that all the time. This battle is also important because it's the debut. We see for the first time the use of the Browning automatic rifle. Browning is a huge name in gun production, and for the first time we see the use of an automatic rifle in this war, which is pretty big. We had seen machine guns and Gatling guns before, but this was a single-handed, one-man operation of using an automatic rifle. That was pretty big, okay? Overall, this battle, MEUSE-ARGONNE, it's going to take 47 days. It involves 1.2 million Americans. That's a lot. 1.2 million Americans fought in this one battle. And the biggest name to come out of that battle was not John J. Pershing, but rather a guy named Alvin York. Alvin York was amazing. He was like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the time, except that he was kind of a small guy. And he wins the Medal of Honor from his duty here. He single-handedly, he gets like bogged down by the Germans, but he single-handedly kills 20 Germans and takes 132 of them as prisoners of war. Single-handedly. That's amazing. So he goes on to win the Medal of Honor. He also goes on to be an actor in the early days of Hollywood. So you can probably pull up some YouTube clips of Alvin York in action. And then the Germans are going to retreat at this point. We are not far from the armistice.